channel. This is a review of the Olympus 17mm f1.8 lens for Micro Four Thirds cameras. We will take a closer look at all the important aspects of this lens. If you're interested in photography, lenses and camera equipment, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. I'm interested to hear your opinion about this lens. Please write what you think about it in the comment section below. Olympus has been one of the major manufacturers of lenses and cameras. They have a good reputation for quality optics. The Micro Four Thirds standard is developed by Panasonic and Olympus in 2008. However, due to the lower sales volume on the system camera market, Olympus has recently moved towards selling the imaging division to an investment fund. According to related statements, the Olympus brands for lenses and cameras will be continued within the new company. The lens in this review was developed by Olympus some years ago. It can be bought new and it will presumably also be around for a very long time on the second-hand market. It is a 17mm wide-angle lens, which is equivalent to 34mm focal length for a full-frame camera. It can be used for portrait as well as low-light photography. This lens has a special place in my heart for several reasons. First of all, I find the 17mm focal length the most useful of all focal lengths. If I were to choose only one lens to use, it would be a 17mm lens. It can be used for close portraits or portraits where the environment is a part of the image. It can capture landscapes without making things look too small or far away. Wider angle lenses capture more surroundings while making many objects look small and distant. This lens has a fairly wide maximum aperture, which makes it good for street photography, nighttime or daytime. And it can be used to create object isolation to some degree. Apart from the reasons mentioned, the form factor is in line with the Micro Four Thirds philosophy. It's very compact and lightweight, and it's fully automatic. There are lenses with slightly better specifications, but those typically cost a lot more and have heavier weight and larger physical dimensions. I will get back to that at the end of this review. First of all, let's have a look at some sample images I shot in Tokyo. First I will look at the physical aspects of the lens, then the specified optics and functionality, before moving on to various aspects of image quality. Finally, I will present my conclusions about the lens, with some comments on how to use it and what kind of photography it's good for. Let's start with the physical characteristics of the lens. I measured the weight to be about 116 grams without lens caps, which is very light. I found the length to be about 40 millimeters including lens caps. It is 35 millimeters sticking out from the camera, which is very compact. The filter thread has 46 millimeter diameter, and the diameter of the lens itself is 57 millimeters. The lens has no aperture ring, which I think is perfectly okay. If the aperture is set manually, it's better to do it from the camera body instead of using an aperture ring. The advantage of doing so is that it is easier to see the aperture setting in the finder, especially in darkness, and it's also good to be able to do it while aiming the camera. The focus ring on this lens is very nice to use for manual focusing. When it's set at the front position, it's autofocus setting automatically. When the focus ring is pulled back, the camera is set to manual focusing. In that position, a distance scale also appears on the lens, as well as a depth of field scale. Apart from being cool, the manual focus ring is a joy to use as well. To go back to autofocus mode, one only needs to snap the ring back to the front position, and the camera is automatically set to autofocus mode. As with many other Olympus lenses, there is one thing I don't like, which is that the lens hood has to be purchased separately. Usually the original Olympus lens hood is very expensive, but there are much cheaper third-party alternatives. I bought a lens hood for a 14mm lens that also can be used with this lens. The cost of that was less than half the price of the original lens hood. There are usually alternatives on Amazon or eBay. The lens feels solid and high quality without being heavy or big. The focus ring with depth of field scale gives it a nice vintage feel. The lens is not weather sealed. If you intend to use it outdoors in bad weather, then that needs to be considered. The focal length is 17mm as previously mentioned. That corresponds to a 34mm lens for a full frame camera. That makes it a wide angle lens. It has aperture settings between f1.8 and f22. The aperture has 7 circular diaphragm blades. The outer focus lights and highlights appear as nice circles. The background can be blurred out, especially when shooting at close distance. The closest focus is 0.25 meters, which is not really macro distance at this focal length, but not far from it. The sharpness of the lens makes it possible to crop the images a bit to get the closeness, which can be counted as a macro. Of course, at the expense of pixel resolution. As long as the image is not magnified too much, the human eye cannot resolve pixels even if the image is cropped to half the size. This lens is full automatic with aperture setting from the camera as well as autofocus. That makes it easy to take quick shots, for instance when using aperture mode with autofocus setting. The widest aperture makes it possible to shoot with fast shutter speeds, and the wide angle makes the image less sensitive to motion compared to longer focal lengths, which magnifies every movement. There is no image stabilization in the lens. I use Olympus cameras which have image stabilization in the camera body. For that reason I don't mind using lenses without built-in image stabilization. But if you use a different camera brand, for instance Panasonic, that is good to know. The lens communicates EXIF data to the camera, in other words focal length and aperture setting for each shot is saved to the image files. I have shot photos of a test pattern using various apertures to check if there's any vignetting or distortion in the images. The resulting images show very little distortion and a slight vignetting, mainly at the largest aperture f1.8. The vignetting decreases rapidly from f2.0 and on. You can stop the video for each setting and have a closer look at the test images. When looking at the center and edges of the test images, it's possible to see the sharpness for the different aperture settings. Overall, I find this lens to be very sharp even for the largest aperture f1.8. The sharpness seems to be best around f2.8 to 3.5, and it loses a bit of sharpness near f8 due to diffraction, which is also visible as star patterns in photos of lights in darkness. At f1.8 there is a tiny amount of chromatic aberration. The chromatic aberration is very limited, and when aperture is stopped down a bit, it's gone. I find the color rendering and contrast excellent in the photos shot with this lens. The sample images give an idea about the color rendering. My impression of the color rendering is that it's very slight blue-purple tint to the images. That may have to do with the design of the anti-reflective coating. If warmer tone is needed, it's easy to adjust in post-processing. Overall, the images are very sharp and with high quality. When looking at flare in daylight, mainly when shooting against bright light sources, there is a very limited amount of flare. I would say it's well controlled. It may appear some ghosting, but if a lens hood is used, it will be reduced to a minimum. There is no noticeable flare in nighttime images of dark scenes, and around f8 a diffraction star pattern appears around the light sources. Overall, this lens handles flare very well. When using the largest aperture f1.8, the background can be blurred out, especially if the object in focus is near the camera. The out of focus lights and highlights appear as circles. The bokeh is smooth and looks good. The typical use for this kind of lens is low light photography. It can handle dark environments with not too much movement in it, portraits including some of the environment, people photography and street photography, daytime action photography when using wide aperture and fast shutter speed, landscape photography, artistic photography using the shallow depth of field, and some architectural photography. Here are my conclusions about this lens. The negative and the positive. First, the negative. No lens hood is included. There is no image stabilization, and the lens is not weather sealed. The positive. This lens is very bright and has low light capability. It's very sharp. It has small amount of distortion. It supports automatic focusing and aperture control. It has a very nice focus ring. It is very compact and lightweight. The focal length is very useful for all-round use. And in general, it produces very sharp and contrasty images. As mentioned, this is an excellent all-round lens, which can be used for portraits, documentary photography like photojournalism or product photography. It is also useful for artistic photography using the shallow depth of field and the low light capabilities. It can also be used for action photography since it's fully automatic, for instance at sports events. This is not a cheap lens considering just the price, but in relation to its performance, size, weight and the excellent image quality, it is actually a very good value for the money. In general, the optical performance of fully functional lenses on the second-hand market is usually more or less the same as new lenses, so there may be a bargain to be found there, which would bring the price down for photographers on a budget. Otherwise, the price for a new lens is about $400 US, or about the same amount in euros in year 2020. There are quite a few lenses available around this focal length, but not many have the same overall high specification as this lens. Other lenses may have larger apertures, for instance f1.2 or f0.95, but then the size and weight of the lens makes them bigger and heavier. Some are also manual and may not transfer the EXIF data to the camera. I myself like bright lenses with very large maximum aperture. but I can't help thinking that this lens is the optimal balance between performance and form factor. For instance, the Olympus 17mm f1.2 Pro lens has, according to reviews, excellent image quality and smooth out-of-focus blur. But that comes at a very high price. It comes at about 3 times the price of this lens, and it weighs 3 times more, and it is about twice as big. Is the difference in brightness and image quality worth the extra price, weight and size? The aperture f1.8 is quite good, although f1.2 gathers more than twice as much light. Each photographer that doesn't have unlimited resources has to decide the priorities and how much is worth getting this extra specification. Some third-party lens manufacturers have even more spectacular specifications, such as f0.95, but those are usually manual lenses with no support for autofocus or aperture setting from the camera. I cannot go into too much details, but there are some good alternatives which are all interesting in one way or another. The Olympus 17mm Pro f1.2, as I mentioned. It is weather sealed and much brighter with f1.2, but it's also bigger and heavier and much more expensive. The Panasonic Leica DG Summilux 15mm f1.7, it is slightly more expensive at about $550. It has good reviews and the focal length is 2mm wider, but not much brighter, about the same size and weight as the Olympus 70mm f1.8. The Sigma 16mm f1.4 is almost the same focal length, and the price is also about the same, at about $380. It has a bit wider angle, but it is bigger and heavier. Not much brighter compared to the f1.8. It's about 65% more light gathering, which corresponds to about half exposure value or aperture step. It has 3.5 times the weight, and it's about 2.5 times longer than the Olympus lens, but slightly brighter. The Voigtlander 17.5mm f0.95 is twice as expensive, but it's a very interesting lens which has very good optical performance. It is manual and it's very big and heavy. It's 4.5 times the weight of this Olympus lens and about twice as long. Then there's a new lens from a manufacturer in China which I'm not very familiar with, but that has received very good reviews recently. It is called Zhongye Mitacon Speedmaster 17mm f0.95, which in specification is about the same as the Voigtlander. This lens is made in China by a Chinese company. All the other lenses here are from Japanese manufacturers, although they may be produced in other countries. The interesting thing about this Chinese lens is that it comes at a very affordable price, which is about $400, which is the same as this Olympus lens in this review. But it is manual and it's a bit heavy and big, almost 4 times the weight of the Olympus lens and about twice as long. But it comes at an attractive price. I have no experience of this brand, so I can only refer to the reviews I have seen. And it is interesting at f0.95, but it is a kind of a different kind of lens. Finally, I repeat what I said before. The Olympus 17mm f1.8 in this review may not have the highest specifications such as f0.95, but the overall specifications of size, weight and performance is better than most alternatives. Of course, it's tempting to go for a wider aperture, but that will immediately lead to trade-offs when it comes to form factor, price or automation. Whether or not these trade-offs are acceptable depends on the priorities for each photographer. So, is this lens good value for the money? My conclusion is that it's extremely good value. If you're on a budget, check out the second-hand market. Again, this is a very useful focal length, in my opinion the most useful of all focal lengths. And this Olympus lens is a high performer in a light and small package. I hope this was useful information for you. If you find this video interesting, please like and subscribe. I will make a review of a Samyang fisheye lens soon. Until then, have a nice week and stay safe.